ANC NEC virtual meeting is underway, but like many of us, suspended Secretary General Ace Magashule is in the dark about proceedings. He was removed from the meeting earlier. Magashule was suspended on Wednesday after he failed to step aside from his position. He's facing multiple criminal charges. Let's unpack this with political analysts Professor Sipho Siepe and Levi Ndou. I'm going to start with you, Professor Siepe, here in studio. So there's already been conflict surrounding the issue of the step-aside rule. There is going to be further contestation as the SG is set to appeal his suspension. Let's talk about the constitutionality, the legality, and what battles we can expect surrounding the step-aside rule, the NEC, the resolutions made at NASREC 2017 regarding the specifics of who should be asked to step aside, and what internal processes should be exhausted before we get to a stage of a legal challenge.
Yeah, first of all, we are a constitutional democracy, and the ANC is credited with other liberation movements for having brought that constitutional democracy. And the constitution is considered is the supreme law of the country. And when you look at all ANC's constitutional stipulation, at the end of that, they always say, but this must also be consistent with the laws of the land and the constitution of this country. And when you look at the step aside, what people are focused on are the first two elements that says all people who have been accused of or reported to have been engaged in some criminal activity or corrupt activities. Those people must account to the Integrity Committee, and then they must be, if they don't provide a proper explanation, they should be suspended and sometimes even be summarily dismissed. Now, that is what the ANC had put in place as a way of dealing with corruption. But when you go to Clause 6 of the same step-aside resolution, it says, but this must also be consistent with the Constitution. Now, the Constitution of this country is crystal clear. It talks about people being presumed innocent until they're proven guilty. What the ANC has actually done, it has said, because you've been charged, especially in this case by the NPA, what they've said that the state action is sufficient for people to be suspended. So some people within the ANC may actually say, but this is not consistent with the constitution of the country. But what they have not done is to try to say, can we take this resolution and question whether it is consistent with the constitution of the ANC, because the notion of the presumption of innocence is also part of the constitution of the ANC, but also it's the constitution of the country. And the constitution of the country is very clear that all law or conduct that is not consistent with the constitution of the country is invalid. So the validity of that clause can still be challenged, but it has not. The ANC members have not done so, because if you go to court, the court wants to be assured that you have also dealt with the internal remedies that are available to you. So people like Magashule and the others who would be suspended or have been suspended can use the appeal process within the ANC to simply say, the way this has been dealt with, it is not fair, and it's not just and fair, but also it falls short of our own constitution as the ANC and also that of the country. So only then will they go out. And the ANC has also discouraged members from simply rushing to the courts. So the first port of call of appeals will be within the ANC. But looking at the numbers, you can see that the ANC will be very busy. And also when members start taking the ANC to court, it will be also another process that is very long. So they need to think carefully in this NEC about what the implications of this are, because the ANC, especially with elections, it cannot spend most of its time even to defend itself against its own members. It has to make sure that when these things are done, they are done. You see, you can have your view that is very strong, but we are required to make sure that you do it properly. There have been people who have managed to get away with murder mainly because those who are administering the process of justice have themselves undermined the notion of just and fair procedure.
Levi, I'm going to come to you now. It seems that while the NEC has a long list of agenda items for this special sitting of the NEC, their aims are going to be entirely frustrated and focused purely around the issue of the step-aside rule, and particularly perhaps around the suspension of SG Ace Magashule. What do you make of the ANC's focus at such a critical time when so much is expected from it, that it should be engaged with such ultimately narrow issues?
Good afternoon to you, good afternoon to the viewers at home, and indeed to Professor Siepe. I would love to agree with Professor Siepe that the ANC is faced with a challenge of, in the main, credibility. And based on the credibility challenges that the ANC has now, unfortunately, they have to focus on issues that have to build the brand ANC. And the situation that the ANC finds itself now is that they need to ensure that they implement their decisions and decisions that they took at conference, taken by the branches, which is not an easy decision to implement. But also at the same time, you would always have very good arguments that talks about the constitution of the country and the constitution of the ANC. But in the main, the ANC for me has become its own enemy, in the sense that when decisions are taken or resolutions are adopted, certain specific elements that are supposed to be ironed out are actually not ironed out, and that creates a situation where there is always a loophole or certain holes that are supposed to be fixed in those resolutions. But also, you need the ANC that has got members that are always comfortable and adhere to the decisions that are actually taken. Because outside this step-aside issue, I've also witnessed an element of ill discipline by some members of the party. And of course, that is not good for the ANC that still has to go towards local government elections as a united force. But also at the same time, for me, I think the ANC must be able, out of this NEC meeting, to come out clear on issues of discipline and the way forward, and we need to see a united ANC. Whether that is possible or not, it will depend on the men and women that are meeting at that NEC to ensure that come Monday, the ANC comes out united and the credibility of the party has to be intact.
Professor, when we talk about unity, we have to acknowledge that unity is built around key leadership figures. A couple of weeks ago, when there were still questions around whether the SG would in fact step aside or not, there were questions about whether this situation within the ANC would lead to a leadership struggle, a serious leadership struggle in which President of the party, Cyril Ramaphosa, would find himself on the back foot. How do you think this NEC meeting is likely to either secure his position or continue tensions forward?
Well, I think the ANC must be understood as a contested terrain, mainly by virtue of its own, how it is constituted, and it prides itself as a broad church for that reason, that there's a multiplicity of orientations or strands. You have the capitalist, you have a communist, you have a socialist, you have a traditionalist, you have an internationalist, you have a social democrat. So one must always understand that there will always be that tussle. And in that sense, it can say we are also the universe of a number of ideas because they are all contained here. But this is also one of its challenges, that because of its failure to resolve what it really stands for, this becomes always a cause for concern. And when what we've reached now is the deepening of those contradictions, that you can't be a socialist and at the same time be a capitalist, because their interests are very different. One is interested in profit, and the other is interested in something, a distribution of whatever wealth. But these issues will always be there. So one must understand that the contestation is part and parcel of being in that movement. But what we are dealing with right now in terms of unity is really that when decisions are taken and resolutions are taken, there must be consistency in the application. Even when you deal with issues of discipline, you cannot have somebody who is said to be corrupt here and another one who is said to be corrupt there, and then you identify this and say, we will deal with this one and we'll leave this one. And this is where there is a greater challenge. You have serious allegations that have been made about some people. You have people who have even gone to open cases, having sworn affidavits to the police, and yet you have not seen the NPA being engaged in saying, let us follow those people. And the issue of whether the NPA is not partisan or is not sufficiently independent is an issue that we must actually raise. Because when you have many people who say, as a citizen, I have observed the following, and then you have, in some cases, rumors that are made about certain people being corrupt, and the NPA jumps, then that failure to deal with things consistently impacts on the ANC, because there are some people who are saying now the state is now being used to purge political opponents. Because right now, even the notion of step aside, the way it has been framed, it starts first with the NPA charging. And then you have the issue of constitutionalism to say, just because somebody is charged, you cannot presume that they're already guilty. We have had many cases that the NPA itself has withdrawn, and some have been thrown out by the court because it does not done its proper job. So these are the things that the ANC must apply itself to say, what do you say about presumption of innocence, while at the same time you want to disadvantage other people, because once you are out, you're suspended. Those who remain have a political mileage, because if you look at the suspension as the stipulations effectively paralyzes you politically. You cannot act. So that's why we're saying the SG of the ANC at the moment is out in the cold.
Levi, I want to come to you now and pick up on a point that the professor made where he described the ANC as an organization representing varying ideologies within its membership. The suspended SG Ace Magashule has criticized this special sitting of the NEC, saying that discussions are taking place and decisions are made and pushed through by a faction, pro-Cyril Ramaphosa faction of the ANC, whereas previously political discussions took place openly. The leadership said, well, if there are differing opinions, let's take time, let's discuss things openly, and then let's come back to see if we can find a unified voice. What do you think of that criticism?
Well, I think one of the challenges that the current leadership is facing has been the inability to be able to work together as a unit. And that is why, even after Nazareth, having been given the responsibility to unite the ANC, these ANC members are known and identified based on factions. And when the other faction thought that it's very powerful and they lose certain elements of the discussions or positions within the ANC, they would obviously cry foul. What is at hand now is the strategy by the ANC, instructed by their own branches at conference, to fight against corruption. That is seemed to be the biggest challenge within the party. Firstly, I would have expected the ANC to have got a legal opinion. They've got a lot of professionals within the party. They should have got a legal opinion so that when the implementation time comes, they should have been able to implement it having a legal opinion. But another aspect as well is that Mr. Magashule might be correct to say decisions are in favor of a particular faction. But also at the same time, one would say, if decisions are taken favoring a particular faction, is it against what has been agreed upon by the ANC itself? Because the ANC at Nazareth said we need to deal with corrupt individuals, and indeed, the step-aside decision was taken at Nasrec. And one would expect the ANC united to be able not to argue about this matter anymore, but to implement. And the reason why there is this type of conflict, it is because the ANC wants to take much longer time before implementing some of their own decisions. And who suffers at the end of the day? Indeed, who suffers becomes the ANC and their own followers. In most instances, it is good to take decisions by consensus. But I would love to bring an argument that says, what happens when you need to implement a decision and there is a small section somewhere that keeps on dragging the processes behind? You are then forced to move towards ensuring that you look at the numbers and then you move forward and implement your own decisions. And of course, that might not be favorable to those that are against that particular decision that we have actually taken. But another aspect that I've observed in the ANC today, there seems to be a clear element of ill discipline, and the ANC does not seem to be having a better strategy to fight against ill discipline within its own ranks. And if the ANC does not deal with that, the ANC would actually produce a lot of its members that are ill-disciplined, and they will not be able to control their own members.
Thank you very much both once again for your insights. We have been speaking to political analyst Professor Sipho Siepe and analyst Levi Ndau. That NEC meeting continues throughout the weekend, expected to wrap on Monday.